Well, good evening, everybody. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here as I always am with my good friend Brendan. Brendan Bond, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing excellent, Nick. How about you, buddy?
I am doing much calmer. We were talking just a moment ago, and you said the last couple times we've gotten together, I've been kind of hectic, just because of work stuff, and thankfully that has calmed down a good deal. Kind of like my Super Bowl, twice a year Super Bowl sort of frenzy and professional life has calmed down. That has passed. I spent a good part of my day sitting down with an old polka guy and learning
Ooh,
how to tune accordion reeds better, learning how to drop the pitch by getting a dollop of solder on the tip of the reed and then filing it down.
ooh, that is exacting
Yeah,
work. That sounds
it
cool.
is. It was really cool. He's got my Airtable. So you need an Airtable to blow air, obviously,
Right,
but not
yeah.
just blow air, but also draw air in,
Mm-hmm.
so you can simulate the environment inside the accordion. And mine, I have to pull with my hand. He's got this table where he's got one foot controls the bellows going in.
Okay, yeah.
His other foot, he has a foot control, like a sewing machine for a Dremel,
Mm-hmm.
which he uses to
Oh, okay.
file. So
So it's not like it's not it doesn't double as his kitchen table. He's not like trying to eat his eggs in the morning and
right.
his plate's being blown all over the place. So that's good. Okay. A tool for every job. Okay.
A tool for every job. So I am relaxed and learning, and that's my favorite thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know we both picked up book. I went to the library the other day. I picked up a book, but I picked this up because it's Appalachian Folklore Unveiled.
Ooh.
Recently came out. Mysterious happenings of folk spirits and mystic shades from the ancient foothills. But I took it home. I started flipping through it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to some areas that I don't think most Americans consider the Appalachian area. It
Mm-hmm.
certainly is part of the Appalachian mountain chain, but yeah, when you're getting into Connecticut, I wouldn't consider that
Mm,
what we call traditionally Appalachia.
at least traditionally, maybe like maybe like geologically,
Right.
like
Geologically accurate,
yeah,
not culturally so.
right, yeah,
But the thing that really jumped out at me, and again, I've only read some of it. I just kind of
hmm
jumped around. It is written by a couple of people, Carmen Carrion and Darkness
okay,
Prevails, which if you are familiar with listening to spooky stuff on like YouTube and whatnot, Darkness Prevails is one of those channels that I know I've come across
hmm
a few times and definitely listened to quite a number of episodes. So I thought that was interesting to come across that.
that's so cool.
Yeah, and actually on the spine of the book it says it has the title Appalachian Folklore Unveiled, Darkness Prevails. I'm curious if the book really gives things that you couldn't have picked up just by listening to different episodes, because I feel like
Right,
so many times when bloggers or people like that put out a book, it really is just so many of the episodes in print, and
right,
that's kind of hit or miss. But
yeah,
you
yeah.
also picked up a book recently, if you want to talk about that a moment.
Yeah, I have a book right here that I'm very excited to finally have in my hands, and we're actually going to be interviewing the author of this book, not next week, but the week after, hopefully. So you guys all should be getting that interview later this month. So this is I Have Never Minded the Loneliness. So this is Hermits and Their Stories by Timothy Renner. We've talked about Tim Renner quite a few times on this show. He is the host and creator for the Strange Familiars podcast, and has written quite a few books. A few like really formative books for me and you, Nick. And really a prolific writer. He's done a lot of really fantastic work. This one is not necessarily paranormal because it's just about hermits. It's not about like spooky ghost hermits. It's just hermits, how they sit in our society. So from like a folkloric standpoint, I don't know any other books out there that are on this subject, and I'm really looking forward to reading it and learning some things because I think it's going to tell us a lot about the different societies and times that they lived.
No, and as you say, Tim Renner, great guy. We both kind of had a couple chits and chats with him, very very brief on my account, but his Beyond the Seventh Gate
Yeah.
is just if you can only pick up one Tim
Yeah.
Burton book this year, that was such a great one. I appreciated it so much because
Hmm.
one, the writing had some real flow to it.
Yeah.
The writing was considered, and also the stories were too. He was very
Hmm.
critical of a lot of kind of the folklore, especially that which appeared in like weird Pennsylvania and whatnot,
Hmm.
concerning this specific topic with which he writes there. While at the same time, he definitely, I would say, is somebody that believes
Oh
in a
yeah.
lot of the
Yeah.
paranormal stuff. He's also willing to be critical of some of the claims. You know,
Right.
we've talked about the sort of people. I'm put off by the sort of people that believe every building is haunted.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
frankly, if you believe that much, I can't believe anything you say.
Right.
It's like I believe I'm trying to think of a good example. The Canadians aren't doing that great this year, so I can't utilize them as an example. Let's go with Las Vegas Knights. I believe Las Vegas Golden Knights are a great team. That doesn't mean I believe they win every game they play.
Right.
That's
Right.
kind of how I feel about it. So if you consider yourself a believer, that's all well and good. But if you believe everything,
Right. I was gonna say I believe the Jersey Devils suck, but
right?
they have like 30 wins already this year, so what do I
Yeah,
know?
and they kind of
Uh,
defined like the mid '90s
I know.
in terms,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's just
whole trap system and
yeah,
everything.
right. Yeah, no shade to any of our Jersey fans out there.
Well,
But
speaking of hockey,
speaking of
uh,
hockey,
we're going to be
absolutely.
taking a trip to Manitoba
We
today.
are. We
Uh,
are.
yeah, so this is kind of a famous story. You asked me if I was familiar with it yesterday evening, and off the top of my head, I said no, but then I looked into it a wee bit. I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I do
Yeah.
know this story.
Hmm.
I want you to break this down for anybody that maybe is hearing this for the first time, or can you give us the who, what,
Yeah.
where, when?
Yeah,
Certainly
absolutely.
can't say the why.
Yeah, that's we'll talk about that at the end. Yeah, at least our thoughts on it. So yeah, so what this is this is often referred to as the Falcon Lake UFO incident. Um, you'll hear it called Falcon Beach sometimes, or just the Falcon Lake incident. So like you had mentioned, Nick, this is probably in the top tier of UFO reported sightings, and certainly for Canada. So it's one of those cases that I think if you're at all interested in, especially UFOs from a historic standpoint, this is one of those cases that you should at least be passingly familiar with. And then if you want to do a deep dive into it, there are tons of books out there on Falcon Lake. But so, like you mentioned, Nick, we're talking about Falcon Lake, which is in Manitoba, outside of Winnipeg.
It's actually not that far north of Minnesota. If you go up to central Minnesota, Falcon Lake is essentially right on the border between Ontario and Manitoba. Manitoba sits
It's on that
immediately,
side. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
Manitoba is immediately to the west of Ontario. And in fact, some Americans might be familiar with the Angle Inlet, which is this weird place in
Yeah.
America where they have to get over to the rest of America, they have to cross into Canada around Moose Lake and everywhere. It's an interesting little slice of Minnesota. It's just because of
Yeah.
all the lake systems up there. It really, I feel like we should really cede it to Canada. It's a small place anyway, but yeah. So Winnipeg is just immediately to the west of Falcon Lake, which again is on that eastern border of Manitoba with the western border of Ontario, and it's immediately north of central Minnesota.
And so,
If you're familiar with Fargo, I mean, we're probably 150 miles kind of northeast of Fargo.
yeah, so between Fargo and where the weaker thans are from,
Right.
right in
Oh,
between, right
my
in
gosh,
between.
I just my friend's at work, her cat just died while we were at a
Oh
concert.
no.
So when I got back home, I'm like, here's a song
You have to listen to it.
It's
Yeah,
very bittersweet.
yeah,
Plea from a cat named Virtue.
yeah, both of those songs. Yeah,
Well,
Plea
there's
and
three.
then
It's a
oh,
trilogy.
there's a third. Oh, geez, I need to
Yeah.
look. Oh, you know what? I don't know if I can handle the third, but go listen to the two because they're both fantastic, gut wrenching
Ah,
pieces of music.
great. Sorry.
Anyway,
Anyway,
sorry. Yeah,
anyway.
but so we're talking about Falcon Lake, and this is in May of 1967. So again, we're going back a few years. So who part of this? Now we've established the where. This is Stephen Michalak. Is that how we're going to pronounce his name? We said we went back and forth on how we're going to pronounce this. Is it Mac?
Yeah,
Is
this is
Michalak?
again the man's Polish.
Yeah.
Originally, he
Mm-hmm.
became, I believe, he became a Canadian citizen, but came to
Yes.
Canada after the war.
Mm-hmm.
Is Polish. Said that already. We heard it pronounced Michalik, Michalak.
Mm-hmm.
I'm I'm sure we could find other pronunciations. We're going to try to be as consistent as we can, but we're going with
Yeah.
Michalak,
We're
Michalik.
gonna we're gonna try and go with Michalak. Yeah. But Stefan was from River Heights, Winnipeg, which is obviously in the middle of Manitoba. But he had a prospecting claim on Falcon Lake. What we have is we have a 51-year-old, resident of, River Heights, Winnipeg, who has this claim over on Falcon Lake, and he was there. What he was doing was prospecting mainly for gold and nickel, which is something people still do a lot of places. I have a friend whose dad does prospecting on local creeks around here.
Yeah, and I
It's
believe
a
there are larger gold deposits in Manitoba.
right. Yeah, it's probably a little more lucrative than what we're doing down here. But I think he was also looking for like nickel and maybe some other stuff. I think there's a few things you can look for. But he had a claim up there on Falcon Lake, so that's kind of why he's in the area. And so he's an amateur geologist, and by trade he's a mechanic. So that's kind of to set the stage of who this gentleman is. And again, he's 51 years old at the time. The what now of this story, so he's on Falcon Lake and he's following a quartz vein as the stories go. And he's, prospecting, trying to find these metals he's looking for. And it is said that the first thing that kind of catches his attention is a huge flock of geese apparently start making a ton of ruckus. And if you have never been around a few dozen geese, when they get upset, it's a lot of noise, and it's definitely something that gets your attention. So that was what kind of brought him out of his prospecting focus. And when he kind of looked into what the geese were all upset about, that's when he saw these two objects floating about 45 meters up in the air. They were apparently long and cylindrical, almost like not cigar shaped, but he says cigarette shaped, with humps in the middle, and they were kind of glowing almost like a red. So he sees these things just kind of sitting up in the air, and he's just looking at them. One of the quotes is where he says, "What the hell is that? One in the air and the other's coming down, down, down." And I start looking at it and think, "What the hell is that?" So he sees these things, not sure what he's looking at. One of them eventually comes down to a little kind of rock outcropping that is relatively close to where he's at and makes what appears to be some sort of a controlled landing. It's not like a crash and I fell out of the sky. The other one remained hovering there for a little while. This is where like I think the first kind of delineation between types of people. I think some people when they come across two unidentified crafts would just kind of get out of dodge, but Stefan decides to stick around because he's kind of curious at what he's kind of seeing. He actually has enough time over the next 30 minutes to actually sketch what he is looking at. And when you look at the sketches, they're a little more typical flying soft saucer shaped than what he actually says from the cigarette shapes. But they're relatively detailed sketches. They're not like just like quick kids drawings. He tries to actually put in like how like the dimensions and everything. So he has time to sit there. And the dimensions, he says they're roughly about 10 meters by about 15 or about 5 meters. So not small objects. It's not like these are just little tiny crafts. We're talking, 30 feet by 15 feet. And as he's looking at them over the next 30 minutes, he decides to go take a closer look. And the first thing that he says he looks for is some sort of insignia, whether that be a NASA logo or a Royal Air Force or something. Because it's clear at this point he is not doesn't seem to be thinking these are UFOs in the extraterrestrial sense. He thinks he's looking at some sort of government aircraft. So he goes over and he says he does not see anything on it. When he's looking at it, there's a few things that is kind of interesting to note about these crafts. He said the color changes from a gray to a red. So that's where kind of the red aura almost kind of comes from, but it looks like it's gray. He says there are no seams on these craft that he can find initially. It's not like they're like pot riveted together or anything. He says that the texture almost looks like it is glass, like it's a very, very smooth. It doesn't look like it's not gray as in like chrome or some kind of other polished metal. It doesn't really look like metal. It looks more like glass, which is kind of unsettling. He also says that there's a strong smell of sulfur coming from the craft, and there is a whirring sound that it is making. So some sort, you'd assume some sort of engine, and there is warm air coming from it somewhere. But so as he is looking over this craft, he gets to the back side of it from where he was originally sitting and sees that there is in fact an open door. He has welder's goggles with him because he uses them when prospecting, whenever he's like chipping at stuff, uses these welding goggles. So he puts them on because he says it's incredibly bright looking inside the craft. Whenever he gets to that door kind of and looks in, he says that he can see what look like flashing lights and panels. He can't make anything out, but again, this kind of leads to him thinking this is some sort of a, aircraft. He also can hear two voices. He says he can't distinguish what they're saying, but hears two distinct voices. And at this point, he is thinking that this is some sort of, again, government aircraft and that there might be some sort of trouble. So this is whenever he calls out into the craft to try and get someone's attention, because it sounds like there's two people and they're talking. He calls out in actually a few languages, which is interesting. He calls out in English, he calls out in Polish, he calls out in Russian, and he calls out in German, which I think is interesting. That one, he just knows that many languages.
Well, Polish and Russian, I'll tell you this. I don't really know much Polish, but I've looked at it. There's a lot of loan words, it seems, in
Mm-hmm.
Russian. Just on the, okay.
As far as trying to get someone's
I
attention.
can speak a
Yeah.
halting German, and I do
Okay.
know some Russian. I've looked at Polish briefly, but it's a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
hearing some of it, I can pick out. But I
Some
was
stuff.
laughing
Yeah.
because this story was featured in Unsolved Mysteries back
Oh
in the day.
yes, yes,
I
yes.
actually interviewed Stephen in a reenactment.
Mm-hmm.
I giggled to myself, and I think I shared this with you because it says you hear Robert Stack's voice, stentorian voice go, he first tried to communicate in Russian. And during that part, I think he's speaking Polish. I can't say for certain.
Yeah.
But then it says, then in Polish, and then you hear him say, like, he says, welcome. He says, dobre pожалуйста in Russian, and then German. But they flip the two, which I think was
Yeah.
pretty funny in the reenactment. Just have Robert Stack flip those.
But yeah, so he calls out because again, he thinks that this is someone who's might be in distress. And again, he's a mechanic by trade. So like if you have
He's a mechanic with military experience and everything. So
right, so it's not like if I ran into something like this, like I could offer moral support. It's like, hey, if you guys want to talk about it, I can help. Not unreasonable that someone would be trying to help in the situation. He would actually have been helpful probably. But so once he calls out, the voices stop. The door then closes. Like it's like a panel. He says that like three panels come across and the door closes. Also, during this time, he ends up trying to touch the craft, and when he touches the craft, he says that it melts the tips of his gloves. He has like, hide working gloves. So this craft, even though it doesn't feel terribly hot outside of the warm air, it is, scorchingly hot to the physical touch. As he's standing there, the craft, this is when things kind of take a little bit of a turn. As he's standing there, the craft then spins, and when it spins, he notices these panels that open up on the one side of it. Then what happens is the craft goes to leave. It raises in the air about 40 feet. And when that happens, he gets hit with a hot blast of air that comes out of this grate on the side of the side of the craft, and it hits him so hard it knocks him back, and it burns his clothes and catches his clothes partially on fire. So it was obviously something that was very, very hot, and he later postulated that it was some sort of an exhaust vent or something along those lines. But yeah, it raises 40 feet in the air and it leaves. That's like the first half of, I would say, of this incident, or the whole of his experience with the craft, at least. Then there's stuff that happens afterwards, obviously. But yeah, any thoughts to add to the story there, at least? Because I know you watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode. I'm sure I saw it way back when, but I haven't seen it in a long time. Was there
No,
any other details about that part of the
I
experience?
watched that. I watched an interview with his son from a few years ago as
Mm-hmm.
well. I think a couple things are important to put down there. Is that apparently he dies in 1999 ish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He consistently stated that he believed what he saw was an experimental aircraft or some satellite, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely
Yeah.
man-made.
Yeah.
That continued to be his belief. And if the events are true, that's what I would believe too, because 1967, we've talked about Kecksburg, and Kecksburg
Mm-hmm.
has been revealed to have been a Cold War sort of space race
Mm-hmm.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
I have no reason to believe that this would be any different based on that. And a lot of the things that he says are things that were said about that craft too. And in fact, we could even kind of look at the illustration. Okay, the Kecksburg
Mm-hmm.
thing is described as being more acorn shaped,
Mm-hmm.
but I could see how someone would see the image that Michalak draws and
Mm-hmm.
says acorn shape or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there are those things which I will say. It should also be noted that in some interviews that he gives with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police,
Yeah.
it was brought up that it was believed that he had been drinking. He had claimed he hadn't, but that
Mm-hmm.
was contradicted by a local bartender as well. So there from the word go, there are a couple discrepancies in the story. And of course, no
Mm-hmm.
story is going to be 100% on, especially as it's told and retold and whatnot.
Right.
So I have mixed feelings about this, honestly.
Yeah.
I know some skeptical people have said that the burns, which I
Right.
know you're going to get into more,
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
a result of an accident and that this story was to cover that up. I don't know if I believe that this story was to cover up those burns or what, but it is an interesting story.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reminded, so I looked up to confirm this. The Weaker Thans did put out an album about
Yes.
Falcon Lake. So
They did.
this is
um
really going to be the Weaker Thans
Kudan's
episode.
episode. Yeah, which is fine. That's yeah. I'll have to see if I
They
can.
deserve it.
They
John's a great
really,
writer.
yeah, they really do. Yeah, can't say enough about them. But yeah, so the burns, like you mentioned, so this is when it gets in like the aftermath of the incident. So what ends up kind of happening, it takes him about 9 hours to eventually get back to Winnipeg. Because what happened in the interim is he tried to get back to his vehicle, but apparently his compass was acting screwy. So it took him a while to get back to his vehicle. Then he also was very, very sick by the time he got back to his vehicle and started trying to make his way back home. In the process, he runs into when he's on the side of the road dealing with whatever illness he's dealing with, he runs into a constable from this Royal Mounted Police constable, and that's where the first of the kind of police reports shows up. There's actually 9 interviews that he gives with those police. At first, they didn't kind of take it very seriously, but then as things kind of kept going, because he was able to produce evidence. Like when they saw him, he had the burned shirt. He had this grid pattern basically burned into his chest.
Well, he had the gloves as
He had
well.
the gloves. Yeah, so he has all this like again what we would call physical evidence of something. There's at least physical artifacts to go along with this incident. Later on, there actually was even they were able to go back. Well, we'll get into the actual investigation part in a sec, but so yeah, the officers weren't sure what was going on initially, but he gets back, goes to the ER. They kind of can't figure like they help him stabilize and everything, but they kind of can't figure out what the real issue is. Some people think that it was burns. Some people think that it was radiation poisoning. Some people thought it was an allergic reaction to something. There was a lot of just weird symptoms associated with it. So much so that he ended up going to actually down to the Mayo Clinic, the world-renowned Mayo Clinic. They performed a litany of tests, both physical and psychological, because it was such an incredible story. Mayo Clinic did find that he was of sound mental capacity and everything. They weren't sure if it was some kind of, like radiation poisoning or some weird like autoimmune disease or something that he was suffering from. But he had these symptoms come back throughout the rest of his life. The grid pattern would subside and then kind of come back at different times. It didn't exactly operate as a burn, but it actually didn't operate just like a straight up allergic reaction either.
Well, and it was said too that there was scar tissue
Mm-hmm.
underneath. So
Right.
yeah, even so, years after the event, you could feel the scar tissue. He apparently referred to it as his buttons.
He has buttons, yeah, which is kind of funny. But yeah, if you look up the pictures, like it looks like he stood in front of a grate somewhere that fired out, something extremely hot at him. It looks painful. Doesn't look great. So something certainly happened. This isn't one of those cases where it's like someone just saying like, "Oh, I saw a thing." Like
Agreed.
there's definitely something happened. Like, now what? Who knows? But
Yeah, was it an incident involving a drunken fire incident, or did he see
right,
the craft as he says?
right.
Yeah, but
So
something happened. He got injured.
yeah, so something
That's
happened.
not in question.
Right. So something happened enough that they started looking into this and taking it seriously. And it wasn't just the Royal Mounted Police, but the Royal Air Force, the Department of Health, the United States Air Force, and other agencies on both sides of the border interviewed him over the following days and weeks. There were searches conducted in the area, and they did find the exact spot that he was talking about. There was a series of, not a series, but there was a circular burn pattern in the rock where he said it would be, and to the point where they actually were able to find melted metal in the rocks that shouldn't just be naturally occurring. Again, not saying that was necessary from the incident, but something melted that metal there.
Right. I
It's
know skeptics.
corollary evidence.
Some people who are skeptical claim that that was planted there after the fact to give more credence
Hmm.
to his story.
Hmm.
I think that sounds convoluted,
Yeah.
but certainly not out of the bounds of
Hmm.
possibility. But it just seems a little bit on the more far-fetched side to me that they would do that in order to spread the story. Be whatever.
Right. It's like what's the like to what end? Um,
Well, yeah,
yeah. And they did apparently find higher than average radiation levels in the area,
right.
which I found on one like very skeptical blog, saying that in that area there are like radium deposits in the area.
Yes.
So it's again not saying that they found radium in that area, but there could be naturally occurring higher levels of radiation just randomly in
I
that
was about to
spot.
say there are so
So,
many minerals. There's so many minerals in that area
mhm,
and geologically that
yeah.
are would elevate a radiation detector.
Yeah, so not.
I know, like if you've ever done like a baseline radiation in your house and then gone down to the basement,
Hmm.
just your being in a basement, especially if you have, like I have a granite
Hmm.
foundation. When I'm in my basement, the radiation levels are like 3 times higher. It's still
Hmm.
like very minimal radiation, but
Still fine. Yeah. Yeah.
there. And yeah, you're going to a place where people are intentionally like hunting for rocks. You're going to come across radiation.
So yeah, like again, corollary evidence doesn't necessarily bolster his claim, but it's at least it's a point in the notebook for this. What ends up happening is, all these folks kind of look into it and everything. And as per usual, all the investigations come out, basically inconclusive. The official reports, none of them say what happened one way or the other. But it seems like they seem thorough. Like I'm looking at a police report here that is like 7 pages, and especially for 1967, given most of the like if on the rare occasions we can find actual police documentation from UFO sightings from the 60s or 70s, it's usually like half of a paragraph. So I will say at least the Royal Mounted Police are thorough, and that might point to how seriously they took it. I don't know about their best practices, but it seems like folks did take it seriously. And that turned into be kind of like the problem. This really kind of haunted Stefan and his family the rest of his life. He was pretty vocal later in life about how this really was a problem. And even his son ended up writing a book on it and everything. And that's what a lot of the focus was on, was around like the media hype and everything that came after it. And it's almost like that's the more interesting part of the story to some people, is just like how we talk about with Roswell or other things, like the lore built around these things is all, and how society reacts to them is almost just as interesting sometimes versus the actual incident themselves.
Well, and just to put a pin in Roswell for a second,
Hmm.
I know we've talked about this,
Hmm.
and it's recently come to my attention that Roswell was not that big of a story in the
At the
immediate
time.
wake of it occurring.
Right.
Roswell, the lore of Roswell doesn't really pick up until the 60s, until really around this era. That's how I've come to understand it. It's just
Hmm.
like with the Kennedy assassination, we assume that like with 9/11, everybody's watching the Zapruder film. Well, apparently the Zapruder film wasn't made public until way down the line. So a lot of the iconography
Hmm.
of that event is much later
After the fact.
happening.
Yeah.
So I do want to point out that I think this may have gotten a lot of attention, especially with regard to U.S. authorities,
Hmm.
well, and Canadian authorities too, because this is the Cold War,
Hmm. Right. That's.
and this is 1967.
Hmm.
This is between man walking on the moon and the Americans claiming the victory in the space race
Hmm.
in Sputnik, and this is only Bay of Pigs is the Kennedy assassination. It's just a few short years before. So this is a very
Hmm.
time, and you have this person who is intriguing because he is ex-military,
Hmm.
right? He can speak Russian. He's Slav, so I can't imagine a world in which the American governments hear that this man claims to have come in contact with an experimental craft of some sort. He's talking about, he's being public about it. Of course, they're going to come in and they want to make sure it's not the Soviets.
Right.
And because they don't want the Soviets putting any sort of, if you found that your enemy could fly over undetected and land right next door, just within 100 or
Right.
so miles of your,
Hmm.
that, I mean, that'd be very, so they have a vested interest. I do believe that ultimately,
Hmm.
the American conclusion. I'm thinking about United States Colonel John B. Alexander, who was involved in this. I think his
Hmm.
ultimate conclusion was that Michalak had an alcohol-induced incident, injured himself,
Hmm.
and that this was all for naught. And I don't know. I think I go there. I don't dismiss that both things could possibly be true. That he had been drinking, maybe injured himself, and also saw a craft.
That's, yeah,
Because a
that's
craft would, because again, so many of these stories where people are adamant that this is just, I cannot tell you what I saw, but I know it wasn't man-made. Well, okay, you've already ruled something out pretty strongly for
right.
being able to say what it is. Those people, all they so often they say there was no clear sign of propulsion. Well, Michalak is clearly, it seems, being burnt by some sort of ventilation exhaust
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing.
Right.
Um, that suggests some sort of gaseous propulsion system, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
So I I credit Michalak for not capitalizing on the UFO thing. He again remains consistent that it was a man-made thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's everyone else that's saying the UFO stuff. Right.
Right. And so
Yeah.
if I were an American or Canadian authority concerned that the Soviets are encroaching, or if I'm a Canadian authority, British Canadian authority, worried about the Americans
Mm-hmm.
entering our airspace, I would want to hear this man out because again, military experience, what does that account for, especially since World War II? But it gives him some sort of standing, and then the time and the place
That's that
makes him a
context.
person of interest. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's interesting because like again, he is pretty steadfast. It's everyone around him that is saying UFO from like an extraterrestrial standpoint. Obviously, it's something that he didn't know what he was looking at.
I got just one quick thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I put this out there. What if he did see an American craft,
Mm-hmm.
American experimental craft? We know obviously we know that this has happened, and part of the discrediting was to suggest the alcohol thing, like oh
Mm-hmm.
he saw something, but
That's
he's not
yeah.
reliable, and that was a way of downplaying. Like yeah, we have a craft. I don't know enough about American military bases,
Yeah,
uh,
at that
to be
time
able
in
to
that
say
area.
what would be close there. But I'm sure there's one. We have so many of them,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah,
So
no,
maybe
that's
it's a
true.
discredit, like, yeah, keep this under wraps sort of thing.
Like that's the thing is it doesn't a lot of it doesn't make sense like for me from the discrediting standpoint with the drinking. Like I mean, a lot of people drink. Um I
Absolutely.
think that like when people say oh someone's drunk like that seems very dismissive assuming the provenance of the other articles and everything. I don't think like I mean again the drawing that he has that he apparently makes at the time. I don't know if someone could be drunk enough to injure themselves for the rest of their lives in some weird way that is never explained, but also like have the penmanship that he has, at the same time. Like I just like again, not saying you can't, but like it's not like an infinitive, but like that doesn't line up. That doesn't line up for me. If it was just him drinking, like the radiation poison, the all the symptoms of radiation poisoning seem strange, given the fact that there was radiation present. Again, both of which are explainable in other ways, but there is at least correlating evidence to say, okay, there was something that left residual radiation at this site.
I'm gonna send so I'm gonna break down my thought real quick,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
but I'm gonna send you something to look at and
Okay.
definitely put the link so the people can take a look at this because this was a Canadian involved craft.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the timeline is correct. Yeah, the timeline would be is a little. It would have been retired. This specific thing I'm looking at
Mm-hmm.
would been retired by 67, but this could have been another generation of this. But my thinking is that I don't think he burnt himself on accident because I think we would be looking at those the buttons and
Mm-hmm.
we'd be looking, is there some sort of grill? Is there like a cold
Right.
grill that would leave those sort of marks? Um, I think I think he did see maybe some sort of
Right.
military craft that was to be
Mm-hmm.
kept under wraps. I want you to look at this. I want you to tell me what you think of this in considering the description
Oh,
he gives.
I've heard of this, but I've never seen it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and this was developed in Canada. It is a flying saucer.
Yeah. Yeah,
The
I've seen.
Avro
Yeah,
car.
yeah. This is the one where that you sit right here. Yeah, it's basically it's a hover. It's like a hovercraft kind of.
Yes.
So yeah, if those of you want to look this up, it's the Avro Canadian VZ9 Avro car. AVROCAR. It's pretty cool. Not gonna lie, it's pretty cool. Looks dangerous as hell. Um, it just like if you're a test pilot, man, you gotta really
Got some gall.
yeah, like those people. Jeez. Yeah, it's one of those things where it looks like a flying saucer. It doesn't necessarily like match all of the description he gives,
No. But
but
this
it's
specific one was retired
yeah,
supposedly
yeah,
in
but it's in the
1961. So by 1967, there
right.
could be another generation of this idea. And if you look at that,
Mm-hmm.
I feel that that alone, in that current iteration,
Yeah.
matches up with so much of how he
Oh,
describes
yeah.
it.
If this thing came over the treetops and landed, I wouldn't think experimental aircraft first. I'd be like, oh, they're here. You know?
Yeah, and you know what?
Like,
I
not
wouldn't
unreasonable.
fault
Not
you for that.
unreasonable. Like, I think that in could any of these aircraft also account for higher radiation? Absolutely. You know, again, given the time. So it's one of those things where like that can be accounted for. I think the surface that he describes of it being like glass is definitely one of the weirder elements of this story. All the experimental aircraft that we can see, I mean, but who knows? Maybe there's stuff that we haven't seen that maybe, is has some sort of a glassy appearance, it being super hot, especially if it's something that works at high altitudes or high speeds, it could be super hot. Like all those things are explainable. They don't all line up, but again, very rarely do all these things line up like neatly in these stories. I think it's more likely that he did encounter something. I think that the him being because I mean I even saw in some writers talking about how he was actually trying to protect a his claim, so he was trying to spread disinformation so people didn't go screwing around there. And if
But
that's the case, that like that it didn't work.
huge backfire,
Yeah,
I'd say.
talk about your all-time backfires. It just doesn't line up
All
in
right.
that.
Let me say this.
Hmm.
I'm gonna go. I think it is more likely than not that he saw something. I believe it was entirely man-made. The U.S., British, Canadian
Hmm.
joint venture,
Yeah.
like we see
Yeah.
with Avro.
Hmm.
I'm sure there were other competing things that were very similar
Right. Right.
for another generation. Avro was still around for a little while after that, and
Hmm.
obviously somebody could have taken that idea and gone further. If he didn't see it, there wouldn't be the need to really
Hmm.
investigate it the way that they did. There are so many claims that
Hmm.
are made that we just let go.
Right.
The fact that there was the specifically the fact that the different parties that were involved in the
Right.
investigation, I think gives credence to that he saw something.
Right. Agreed.
And I think that at least the American military standpoint is that he's
Hmm.
an alcoholic who injured himself having a good time in the woods.
Yeah.
I think if that's all it was, they wouldn't have even put that out. They would have
Right.
dismissed it and walked away and said, "Well, it wasn't.
Right.
We went and investigated. It wasn't the Soviets. It was just some alcoholic. That's it." I think that this is just to kind of put under wraps, like we're not doing anything on here. So I
Right.
think I think he probably more
Hmm.
than not saw something, and he again continued to believe to his death, if everything's to be believed,
Hmm.
he believed it to be a man-made thing.
Right.
Therefore, we need to kind of like let's tamper it down a little.
Yeah. No, I agree with your assessment. This is one of those rare occasions when I think me and you are like 99% on the same page here, for one of these instances. Um I think really the only element that leads me to even entertain the whole extraterrestrial, ultra terrestrial, whatever you want to call non-human side of things is just the surface of the craft. You know, that's the only weird thing. But again, how much of that could just be lost in the details of the story, you know?
Yeah. And again, we don't know if he could say there was anything similar in years to come because again, I mean, look, it's just this has been said a lot. Look at World War II, the
Hmm.
very end of World War II, both the Americans and the Soviets have
Hmm.
jets.
Yeah.
The very end,
Yeah, the
right?
very, very end. Yeah.
Specific models. I'm not that guy, but you look at Vietnam.
Hmm.
Look at the difference between the aircraft in World War II to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And it's staggering,
Yeah, it's
right?
insane. Yeah, it's wild.
And right.
Yeah.
So it's when I look at those experimental aircraft that
Hmm.
put in there we were just looking at, and I see how metallic they look
Right.
compared to like some of the matte looks of generations before. I don't know. I don't know what to think.
But I mean, it's wild because like you're right. Like, but again, in the 60s, if you look at something contemporary to that, look at like the SR-71 Blackbird with its, like you said, matte black, you know, kind of material. Not saying this, not saying what he saw was an SR-71, but like out of context, you've probably never seen a aircraft that looks like that, you know. So it's so you know again maybe his description of the surface being glassy is just like and not metal is just a misinterpretation. Maybe it's just wrong because there's a lot of things that he's taken in and being and having to deal with, you know, visually with this craft. But yeah, no, I think we're on the same page with this actually. I think it's a really interesting case. I encourage people to go look into it themselves because there's a ton of books on it. On the incident, and you know it's one of the more fascinating and well documented ones. And again, I think our kind of takeaway is like this guy definitely saw something. What he saw, we're probably not going to find out. But well, I don't know. Does Canada have the same 50-year declassification stuff that we have?
You know what? I can't say for sure, to be
I
honest with you.
wonder. That's a good thing. We should. I should have looked that up ahead of time. So like, yeah, maybe we will find out. Maybe one day they'll be they'll put up like, hey, actually, this was this was old Jake and Tom from over in the Winnipeg base that decided to land and you know just
All
because
right.
I love the idea of two dudes from Winnipeg just like landing their experimental aircraft and just like arguing about something, and they suddenly hear a gold prospector outside asking them in Polish if they need help.
Well,
Like
and again, you
that's
know what? If you were flying an experimental craft, or you were flying a not let's say not even experimental, one of
yeah,
still a classified craft,
yeah, yeah,
and somebody came up, your job would probably be on the line if you
yeah,
spoke to them. Like
yeah,
in the he says, "Hey Yankee boys, you need help?"
yeah,
Like hey, I got my toolbox here if you need.
yeah.
And it's yeah, yeah, you don't talk. No, 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 no. Just
Yeah, it's just it's almost an absurd situation if it
absolutely.
like that. Yeah, that's the thing is yeah, if this is a completely mundane situation, boy, to be a fly on a rock watching this happen, it probably would have been funny. It's just like, oh my
Someone got
gosh,
chewed out.
yeah, someone like really got in trouble over this. Um,
I mean,
but
either
yeah,
way, it's a very fascinating story, and I think this is one of those stories where there's a whole period in UFO lore where I
right,
look and I go, well, this is just the Cold War madness.
right.
This
That's a
is
lot of
just
it.
the United States and the Soviet Union and all the vassals around them
Hmm.
having to deal with these two superpowers in this very
Worrying about
bizarre.
each other.
Oh
Yeah,
my goodness, what a silly, what an incredibly silly, stupid, and dangerous time.
right, right. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think so
It's something
much
else
UFO stuff can be attributed to like
at that time.
that
Yeah.
period of time and the
Well,
space race. When you think about it, the space race is a very silly thing.
It really is. But we do have an analog kind of just in UFO lore itself because, we had all the black triangle UFOs of the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we have the U-2 and
Stealth bomber.
with stealth bomber and everything. It's like, oh no, we've had these black triangles flying around the
Right.
Southwest. And everyone's like,
I know
oh,
I told you all about the
yeah,
first time I ever saw
yeah,
a stealth bomber was flying over the Peace Bridge,
yeah,
going into Canada.
and you knew what it was, and you probably still were just like, what the heck am I?
Oh,
It's not. They're nuts looking. Yeah,
not only that. I mean, this
yeah,
is the early '90s, and it
yeah,
was crazy. But the wildest thing was that you couldn't see it until it was right on you. Really,
yeah. It's
it was
just
crazy. It was so
super, which is
different. It was so different.
yeah. So again, like that's what I'm saying. So we at least have a precedent for that in UFO lore, where it's like, oh, you see a bunch of weird stuff, then you find out like, oh yeah, that was just government testing things. And again, like understandable that they're not talking about it, or they're investigating it in thoroughly,
Yeah.
So okay,
Well, if you've been in the woods and have discovered what you think might be potentially a classified vehicle of some sort, how would you let us know?
if you believe you find a classified vehicle, I would say let the authorities know first, but
I think
afterwards.
that's the opposite. I think you should, they're gonna tell everybody you're drunk.
That's true, yeah, as evidenced. But if you've seen anything interesting that you think we would like to hear about, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, or you can send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.